Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is James Crabtree. I am the Toy Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and welcome to this Asia Society Policy Institute webinar entitled India's Foreign Policy in 2025, Navigating a Shifting Geopolitical Landscape. We thought that this would be a timely topic with new leadership in the White House and the European Union, with pressure on India's relationships with Russia, and a cautious recent thaw in Sino-Indian relations. The Indian government's strategy of multi-alignment is going to be tested on multiple fronts next year. Obviously, the international environment is complex. There are ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza in which India may be involved, and its own neighborhood in South Asia, with recent changes in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka in particular, add some layers of complexity to India's own diplomatic approaches. So, to unpick this, I have a delightful panel, including a number of stars from the Asia Society itself. Joining from Delhi, we have Nirupama Rao, known to, I'm sure, all of you, the former Foreign Secretary of the Government of India, variously the Ambassador to Sri Lanka, China, and the United States. Joining from New York, Farwa Aamer, Director of the Asia Society's South Asia Initiatives at ASPI. And then also from New Delhi, Akshay Mathur, the Senior Director at the Asia Society Policy Institute based in Delhi. What we're going to do is I will moderate a conversation between our three panelists, allowing them each to talk a little bit and set out their stall at the beginning of the webinar. Then we will have a conversation between ourselves for the balance of our time, and then we'll open it up for 10 or 15 minutes of questions from the audience at the end, and we will stop precisely at the top of the hour. If you do want to ask a question, this being a Zoom event, you can ask it in the Q&A function. I may not be able to get to all of the questions, but we will try our best. This event is also being recorded. So if your question is asked, then it will be out there for everybody to see. So please do have a think about any questions that you would like to ask. I'm going to start with Ambassador Rao. So when you were Foreign Secretary of the Government of India, you had a very good overview of India's relations with the major powers. And I think probably the obvious place to start this conversation, looking towards the next year with Donald Trump's election and the recent deal over the border between India and China, is to look at the two major relationships that India has. So could you talk to us a little bit about how you see those two critical relationships developing in 2025?
Thank you, James, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Actually, James, I'm joining from Bangalore, which is in many ways, the tech capital of India. I don't live in Delhi these days. To answer your question, and you asked for my views on India and the United States and India and China. Now, Mr. Narendra Modi was one of the first leaders to telephone Mr. Trump on his re-election and to congratulate him. So there was a kind of sugar rush, I'd say, about the Trump victory, because going by the first presidency of Mr. Trump, 4 years ago, the relationship between India and the United States did see many sunny days, and the chemistry between Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi has always been very good. And you must have heard, the chatter from the Trump side about how he looks at Mr. Modi and the kind of trust he apparently places in Mr. Modi. So the relationship, the India-US relationship, is a well-sustained relationship. It has been a stable relationship over the last 2 decades. This is not to discount the areas of difference, and I think some of them have surfaced during the Biden presidency. But overall, especially in the area of critical and emerging technologies, I think the relationship has come to be very much defined by the future potential it has, and also the very well-contoured rivalry between the US and China in these last few years. So India is seen very much by the United States as some kind of a bastion in the Indo-Pacific. You talked about multi-alignment and India's practice of strategic autonomy, which really goes along with that definition of multi-alignment, which really speaks of the diversity in the world today. This is really a world between orders. It is a disruptive global situation. And we are essentially, the door is open, as somebody said, waiting for the future to come in. And we really don't know what the delineations of that future will be. Mr. Trump himself has been widely described as being transactional, and his focus on trade and tariffs may cause some upheavals, I believe, in the India-US relationship also. In the past, during his first presidency, he had withdrawn the GSP facilities for India, which is a preference given to many developing countries. But the whole question, the whole scenario of trade between the United States, between a United States headed by President Trump and the rest of the world is open for redefinition. India has a surplus balance of trade with the United States, and the word surplus often attracts Mr. Trump's ire. We'll have to see how he manages that. And but Mr. Trump, as somebody said, does practice elastic politics, and his views on trade and his steps on trade regarding India need not really complicate other areas of the relationship. And I think between India and the United States today, the way these relations have been handled, I believe, is a sign of the very evident maturity in the relationship today. This is a relationship between grown-ups. Coming to China and the India-China relationship, you're all aware of the recent announcement towards the end of October of the decision taken by both sides after many multifarious rounds of talks between the military commanders and the diplomats of the two countries, that there will be disengagement between troops of the two sides who were in very close confrontation in the remaining points in eastern Ladakh. I'll just say the names, Depsang and Demchok. Disengagement had taken place in the four other areas where such confrontation had been present in the past. And this, with the announcement regarding this disengagement, India and China have essentially, I believe, been able to relieve tensions between the two sides. I'm talking of military to military confrontation. I'm not talking of the overall climate in the relationship, which still continues to be fraught by a lack of mutual trust, mutual sensitivity, and mutual understanding. So, but the disengagement has to be followed by de-escalation and the reinforcement of confidence-building measures between the two countries. With China, our largest neighbor, the relationship will always be complex and complicated. And the 30 years of fairly tension-free relations that the two countries did have between themselves from 1988 onwards, that phase is behind us. And today, in many ways, these are days of redefinition of the relationship and marked by a lack of trust, I believe. And the leadership level understanding between Mr. Narendra Modi and Mr. Xi Jinping is just not there, in my view. Their communications have been rather strained and very, off and on in many senses of the word. So trade is very balanced. The Chinese have export to India huge amounts of goods, and India's exports, on the other hand, to China have kind of stagnated, and they're far below what the Chinese export to us. So there's a huge imbalance, but we've grown to be dependent on Chinese imports, especially for intermediate goods in fields like electronics and and pharmaceuticals, for which, as you know, the Indian pharmaceutical industry is very, very important to us. So the strategy that has to be worked out in the next few years of how we deal with that and how we can be beneficiaries of the China plus one and the new supply chains that are being worked out is still, an emerging scenario. We'll have to see how that works out. So this really provides many opportunities for India and the US and our friends and partners in the Indo-Pacific, like, fellow members of the Quad, which is a very active minilateral for the Indo-Pacific, with Japan and Australia besides the United States, and with so much cooperation in technology and critical technologies taking place between India and our Quad partners. So this really defines, I believe, a new geopolitical cartography for our region.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's a nice way of putting it, a new geopolitical cartography. Akshay, let me turn to you, actually in Delhi, as opposed to Bangalore, I think, so I got it right this time. So you lead work on geoeconomics for the Asia Society, looking at India. This is a particularly important moment for that, as the ambassador said. US trade sanctions and tariffs looming, but also other geoeconomic concerns around currencies, subsidies, all manner of things. Would you give us a sense of India's outlook in this area in the coming year?
Yes, actually, before the campaign, before President Trump was elected, during the campaign at the Economic Club, I think the Economic Club of Chicago, where Trump said the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariffs. I think that was the first indication that he was serious. And of course, for India, that's an important development. We all know by now that it's not just India, but all the other countries around the world are preparing for it. Mexico and Canada are preparing for it. China certainly is preparing for it. They've already acted on it. But so is Japan, so is Korea. For us here in India, the United States is a very important trading partner. I think very few, very few people around the world really understand that the United States is really the only country in the top 10 trading partners with whom we actually have a trade surplus. And both in goods as well as in services. So I think what is going for us is that we have a full spectrum geoeconomic relationship. So it's not just trade. Trade, of course, more than 10% of our total trade is with the United States, but approximately 10% of the total foreign direct investment that has come in for the last 25 years has also been by the United States. And the United States is also participating in our capital markets. Up to like 30% or 40% of the assets under custody in our financial markets belong to the United States and the US institutions. And so I think it's a full spectrum geoeconomic relationship. It's not just limited to trade. Anecdotally, we hear that India had come close to signing some kind of a limited trade deal, but there is no evidence of that, and at least it's not in the public domain. But of course, the United States and what happens with trade is going to be important. GSP is something that Ambassador Rao has already spoken about. I would add that beyond trade, the other thing probably that we in India will be watching is what's happening in the global environment, including in our neighborhood. Over the last 10 years, or maybe a little bit more, last 20 years, India has become sufficiently internationalized, right? So the total trade to GDP ratio is 40%. That's substantive. And even the non-oil is close to 25 to 30%. So it's quite a substantive trading relationship with the world. We have nearly $1 trillion in assets around the world. $650 billion is foreign exchange reserves. So what happens in the United States and the health of the US economy really matters. The foreign exchange reserves, by the way, I think we're like now the third in the world, behind only China and Japan, but more than countries like, say, Russia and Saudi Arabia. So I think the health of the U.S. economy is important. We have vested interests there. We also have a growing footprint around the world. Our oil companies have more than like 30 energy assets around the world in different forms, equity stakes, some that we own completely. So I think that what really matters for us is that we really will have to keep an eye on how the international financial architecture and monetary system is developing, whether we have the capital or not. And maybe I'll just end with this. There is, of course, a fear, and although this discussion is not about financial markets, but there is always a concern of capital being pulled out of India. We're a country, we're still a developing country. We need the capital from the United States and any other country in the world. And if chances are high for the United States to raise interest rates, which means that it's possible that capital might get withdrawn, not just from India, from other parts of the world as well, then of course we will have to look for new sources of capital, domestic, but also from other countries. So maybe I'll stop there, James. I would say that two things, one on tariffs, but the other thing is also keeping an eye on some of the other geoeconomic developments around the world. And why that is important to us is because we're now sufficiently internationalized, and what happens outside really matters.
That's a great point, Akshay. Let me now turn. You mentioned the more, as you say, there are a lot of global issues, but we should also look at India's own neighborhood. It's been an interesting year in 2024 with new governments in one form or another in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, and much else besides, lots of diplomatic shenanigans. Farwa, do you I think you could just talk us through what Mr. Modi's objectives are going to be within the neighborhoods and within the neighborhood, and the challenges that he faces?
Absolutely, James. Like you correctly pointed out, 2024 has been a year of important political transitions in India's neighborhood. From Bangladesh post Sheikh Hasina to a new leadership in Sri Lanka, there's been a lot going on. And in many ways, what has transpired this year offers clues for what will be most likely going to be in 2025. For India, its neighborhood first policy has been an important one, and it will likely remain important. We've already seen that from the early months of Prime Minister Modi's fourth term in the office. His inauguration ceremony alone was well attended by almost all South Asian heads of states of that time, minus Pakistan. Apart from just, working with key allies also within the region, we've seen in the fourth term that Prime Minister Modi's government has been pragmatically and proactively engaging with new leaders within the neighborhood. One is, of course, we've seen the visit of President Muizu. Despite an earlier pro-China stance and an India out campaign, it's become, the stance has shifted. And now when the Sri Lankan elections happened and a new president came into place, the External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, visited Sri Lanka to be the first foreign minister since the presidential election meeting with President Dissanayake. So there's a lot of proactive and immediate sort of engagement diplomatically that India has shown with its neighborhood. But also it's very important to recognize that China is present in the region, and it's very much a part of the political and particularly the economic fabric of the region. India has increasingly come to understand and accept it in many ways, and has recognized that given that situation, India has its own role to play as an increasingly important regional development and economic partner for the neighboring countries. It not be all there to match China's prowess, because of course China has this big BRI investment going on in the region and whatnot, but it has the capacity to enhance connectivities with its neighbors, whether it's energy connectivity, as seen by the most recent tripartite arrangement between India, Nepal, Bangladesh, which to me was a breakthrough. There's been medicinal diplomacy that India has been engaging in, then people-to-people connectivity. We are also seeing an active engagement pattern, albeit most of it has been bilaterally or trilaterally, because there's not really a cohesive South Asia regional framework, unfortunately, a platform that exists in a meaningful manner to allow for a sustained sort of regional cooperation to take place. But we have, of course, the BIMSTEC and the BBINs. Unfortunately, SAARC is not as active as it was in its heyday. It's been many years to that, though. But 2024 was unique in many ways. This year we also saw what was first in almost a decade visit by an Indian foreign minister to Pakistan for the SCO summit and the renewal of the Kartarpur corridor agreement. And all this doesn't really resolve the bilateral strain between India and Pakistan, but these are still encouraging objects nonetheless. Now, so when we talk about the year coming ahead in 2025, a couple of things will be important to look out for. One is how will India navigate the political situation that's currently underway in Bangladesh? I think that's a very important one. That's a country that's a top regional ally. It has been a top regional ally for India under Hasina. Things have drastically shifted since the events of August 5. And despite the diplomatic efforts to keep ties stable, there has been discomfort in this relationship. Also because India is currently hosting Hasina, which doesn't sit too well with the new political factions in Bangladesh. Most recently, like this week alone and over the weekend, there have been a lot of anti-India sentiments on the ground, attack on Hindus in Bangladesh, and then counter-protests in India. So it's very important for India now to work with these new factions to foster goodwill among the Bangladeshi populace and to kind of strike a balanced and inclusive policy. And from both ends, it's an interest to work together. And the other element that will be important for India in 2025 is how can it continue to use its economic and financial sort of leverage to deliver on ongoing commitments and partnerships in the region and also explore new pathways for cooperation. And while doing that, what it can do is offer an alternative to China, but also simultaneously keep a close eye on how the region's existing and sort of inevitable cooperation with China is not in any way an impact to India's own security and strategic concerns. The regional countries have also increasingly come to understand the importance and inevitability of India in the region. So appending ties is also not in their interest at all. So going forward, even with the new leaders, there should be an interest to keep working with India. It might be a more balanced way of working where they were willing to work with all important players, China, United States, and others, including India, to support their own economic and development aspirations. So I'll just stop there and happy to continue the discussion later.
Super. Well, let's dive into it. I mean, I think we probably should go back to the beginning and start with Mr. Trump, given it's been the main focus of international discussion since his election victory last month. Ambassador Rao, let me come back to you. You sounded fairly sanguine about the outlook, as if the relationship between India and the US is a relationship of adults, the one in which the two leaders get on with one another. And I think that is a fair reflection of the general view that India was not displeased by the outcome of this election. On the other hand, India-US relations have been deepening significantly over recent years. Do you think that, in a sense, there's a risk that under Trump that forward momentum will stop? That in a sense you'll have a relationship more marked by stasis than forward progress?
Well, I'm fairly optimistic that there will be a further evolution of this relationship in forward-looking orientation and direction, because the kind of base that has been built for the bilateral relationship and the extent of cooperation in so many multifaceted areas makes, I think, for a very stable and, as I mentioned earlier, a well-sustained relationship. So there's no discounting the fact that, leadership makes a difference. But going by Mr. Trump's attitude towards India in the past, I think we can afford to be relatively sanguine about his recognition of the importance of this relationship. I think the focus in this Trump presidency, at least in the first initial phases of it, will obviously be domestic, and that is where the trade and tariffs question comes in. That's where immigration comes in. That's where taxes come in. To what extent India is going to be targeted by any of these, especially trade, as I mentioned earlier, is difficult to really draw a complete picture of. The narrative isn't clear as yet, to answer your question quite candidly. But there is a certain pattern, there are certain contours to the India-US relationship that have sustained it through these years. And as I said, barring certain areas of difference, which will always be there, I think, especially in relations between democracies, I think the relationship is resilient enough to be able to withstand that kind of, that instability or turbulence, if I could call it that. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think that this question of stasis in the relationship really can't be the enduring description of what happens as we move into the future. There cannot be stasis because there is so much happening in so many areas of this relationship. And then if you move to the amphitheater of the Indo-Pacific, this is a very action-oriented relationship. The ties between our two militaries, the security establishments, the intelligence cooperation, what the Indian Navy does in the Indian Ocean, and how we cooperate with the navies of our other Quad partners and our friends in the region, all makes, I think, for a very sort of constantly interactive relationship between India and the United States.
Farwa, since we're talking about the neighborhood, maybe I could come to you. I mean, one thought that occurred to me is that I think we expect under President Trump an intensification in US-China competition, even beyond what we've seen in the last few years. I wonder how that looks like from South Asia. Is there a scenario in which South Asia becomes more of a focus of competition between the US and China, in which India finds itself having to manage not just China's incursions into South Asia, but also US interest in the region as well?
Yeah, with a largely sort of confrontational approach to China, I mean, South Asia has been an important sort of geostrategic location that way, where the US-China competition has been playing out. Even under the under the Biden-Harris administration, we saw that. And it will continue if there's a more confrontational sort of approach from the United States towards China. Increasingly so, there are very deep economic sort of ties that these countries have with China, but they're not completely opposed to the support of the United States. They work with the United States, they have trade with the United States. A lot of these countries are dependent on IMF bailouts. So there has to be some sort of a balance that South Asian leaders and South Asian governments will have to strike, knowing that there's a bit of a transactional approach towards the foreign policy that the Trump administration will pursue. There will also be expectations from the region to sort of do more and show more. I would agree that, within the region, with what Ambassador Rao said, with regards to India kind of being that indispensable partner, the relationship largely remains bullish. Everyone remains bullish on that, and that there's a lot of optimism. And it'll continue to be that sort of a stable partner in light of China's presence in the region. But from the Indo-Pacific outlook, from the Indian Ocean region outlook, and from purely sort of security standpoint and how the United States will approach China in the region, I think countries like Sri Lanka, a country like Bangladesh will become extremely important should there be the right policy approach. So that remains to be seen. We have not had a coherent South Asia approach coming from the administration in the last few years. So going into the coming years, whether the Trump administration will have sort of a cohesive South Asia policy, where you'll have a sort of streamlined approach towards how the United States is willing to engage, whether we know that there'll be no sort of long commitment ways of engaging with South Asia, or for any other region for that matter. That's not how President-elect Trump works. But what are the other ways in which there could be win-win for both these regional countries and the United States? So, but it's safe to say that most countries will try to strike a balance.
Akshay, just finally on the relationship with the US, one of the early remarks that Mr. Trump has made on his Truth Social platform was a small broadside against BRICS nations and the sense that the BRICS might be developing a new rival currency to the dollar, which is an extrapolation of what happened at the recent BRICS summit, in which there was some discussion of creating electronic currency platforms. And he threatened BRICS members, which would include India, with 100% tariffs. This may be one of these examples in which it might be wise to, as people tend to say, take Mr. Trump's statement seriously, but not literally. How do you read it?
So actually, at the same conversation at the Economic Club of Chicago, he made a statement which, because of the statement on tariff, actually the second statement on the dollar got overshadowed. But he said something to this effect. He said, if you want to go to third world status, he was talking to his own citizens. If you want to go to third world status, lose your reserve currency. We have to have it. We cannot lose it. 100% tariff on everything you sell into the United States, right? And so, again, that was an indication that this statement that he's just made right now was coming. I think on the BRICS currency, having a unified BRICS currency is a pipe dream. I mean, it's a long shot by any standard. I also think, though, that it's not just India. There have been experiments that have been taking place of local currency settlement now around the world. And some of it is under the framework of BRICS, and the others not so much. So, for instance, as different countries around the world trade more with China and they accumulate renminbi, there's going to be a latent desire to use that renminbi to pay for other imports or maybe keep them in the foreign reserves. Now, what has happened is that, for instance, when Argentina was in a grave macroeconomic situation, IMF allowed them to use renminbi to pay off their debt. Saudi Arabia has made a deal with China to actually do renminbi settlement. There's a deal between India and United Arab Emirates to do local currency settlement in dirhams. So these little experiments have been taking place. Not for creating a unified currency, but at least do local currency settlement. And for India, I think our government has already made it very clear that it is not seeking to set up a different a BRICS currency. But certainly in the different BRICS initiatives, there has been an attempt to at least settle some of the trade in local currencies. And I think the main reason for that is to avoid a disruption. For the last 10 years, India has seen different kinds of sanctions being imposed on countries that we have traded with, including Russia and Iran. And so this was just seemed like a good alternative. So I think for us here, we have a vested interest in the United States. No other country in the world has deep of capital markets like the United States to hold a major global currency. And we have $600+ billion in reserves, out of which about 50%, I think, is in US dollars. But nonetheless, for rupee, I don't think there's a threat from the rupee. For the rupee to be internationalized or to be used, we have a long way to go. And I think what may happen at most is some local currency settlement might happen. And probably the signaling to all the BRICS countries, which, as you know, is not just 4 or 5 countries now, it's 10 countries with another 20 standing at the door, is not only to put a stop to the idea of the unified currency, but also to maybe put a pause to the local currency settlement, out of which the main beneficiary right now is China with its renminbi.
Great. Well, we've got some good questions coming in from our audience here today, so thank you very much for that. I'll turn to them in a little minute. Ambassador Rao, could I just press you a little bit on China? The recent agreement that you eloquently gave an overview of, I think amongst some of India's partners in the Quad nations, in Washington, in Europe, may have been greeted with a little nervousness in the sense that it opens up the question of, might India now pursue a broader a set of cooperative measures with China and move away from those partners. Do you think that's a realistic scenario? I mean, you said the nature of the relationship is now fundamentally different from the period between 1998 and 2020, but what happens next in the bilateral relationship between India and China? Are more deals and a softening of relations possible?
I believe, James, that these are still troubled times in the India-China relationship, despite the announcement of disengagement in those last 2 points that I mentioned in Eastern Ladakh. You referred to the trepidation or some degree of concern among our other friends and partners about these recent developments between India and China. I think the need to relieve military-to-military tensions was very, very real, because this situation, at such high altitudes in what is perhaps the most difficult terrain in the world, could not have been sustained, indefinitely. And I think for both countries, it was important that we came to this understanding on disengagement. And India held its position all these years. India was very clear, and you've heard our foreign minister say this on many occasions, that the status quo in the relationship prior to May 2020 should be restored, and that was the necessary first step to the road, or at least both countries taking the road to restoring some normalcy in the relationship. And finally, it was China, I believe, that came round to agreeing to this disengagement, which India had been waiting for all these years. And we had been discussing this, as I said, between the military commanders and the diplomatic officers of the two sides for 3 to 4 years now, in fact. So where does this relationship go next? It's, as I said, what happened in June 2020 was a very fundamental shock to the very foundations of this relationship, given the fact that there had been no bloodshed on this border, on this line of actual control, since 1975, 45 years, in fact. And that spell, as it were, was broken when you saw the death of 20 of our soldiers in Galwan and about 4 to 5 Chinese soldiers in the same incident. So these sort of incidents, I think, can cause a lot of harm and hurt and damage to bilateral diplomatic relationships between countries, and especially between two such large countries such as ours. So what is the outlook for this relationship is very difficult to say. Farwa talked about China in South Asia. And if you look at, the Chinese moves in South Asia and the kind of maneuvers they've been making over the last few years with the BRI and other, diplomatic outreach that they have developed with many of our smaller South Asian neighbors, it's very clear that there is a kind of, if I may call it, a containment policy that China follows vis-a-vis India in our region. So there is definitely competition and rivalry out there. And just as Farwa mentioned, the very pull of gravity, as it were, in South Asia, which makes our neighbors really, in a sense, undertake some self-correcting moves as far as their relations with India are concerned, has tended to prevail, although I would concede that the present situation in Bangladesh after the ouster of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has been quite troublesome, and not just for Bangladesh, but also, in our region, and particularly for India, because Bangladesh is such a crucial neighbor for us. We share a border of over 4,000 kilometers, even longer than the India-China border with Bangladesh. And in many senses, Bangladesh becomes a kind of one of the gateways to our northeastern states. And we had so much in the pipeline to improve infrastructure, trade connectivity, business ties with Bangladesh. And that relationship, in a sense, has been disturbed by recent developments. And the treatment of Hindu minorities in Bangladesh is obviously a matter of concern to the BJP-led government in Delhi. That is inevitable. Things with Afghanistan have improved, I'd say, even though it's a Taliban regime there, Taliban government. We haven't established formal relations with them, but certainly there has been some kind of a thaw, and there has been start of communication, let me say, between the two sides. The China-Pakistan relationship, of course, continues to be very strong and ongoing, although the Chinese have faced difficulties with their projects in Pakistan lately. And as far as the India-Pakistan relationship is concerned, even though our foreign minister was there for the SCO summit, I think in terms of what the outlook on this relationship is going to be, it's very difficult. We haven't built a great wall of India between India and Pakistan, but certainly I think there is stasis in that relationship, to use your word. So all in all, you have a China factor in South Asia, but the pull of India is very strong. India is, and without using the word in a value or a meaning-laden context, India is the dominant country in South Asia by virtue of its size, by virtue of our geography, by the virtue of the fact that we share borders with all the South Asian countries, except for Sri Lanka and the Maldives, where it's a maritime boundary. So the relationship with India is so vital for our neighbors. And someday in the future, I hope that process of more regional integration can be restored. That is not just happening at the moment, but individually with countries like Nepal, with Bhutan, with Sri Lanka, and even with the Maldives, I think ties have held steady, I would say. And connectivity is improving. I mean, look at with Sri Lanka, particularly post the civil war, I think a lot of links have been restored. So ultimately, I think the civilizational ethos that pulls India and our neighbors together is still very strong, and that today gathers more strength and substance by virtue of India's fast-growing economy. It's a leading global economy, and the potential that India exerts and presents to the region and beyond, I think, is a very concrete factor that our neighbors, despite the China factor, cannot ignore.
Great. So we're nearly coming up on questions. What I want to do now is look ahead to some of the events that are going to happen in 2025 and to talk about some are diary events, some are international crises that need to be fixed. Farwa, let me start with you. So we were just talking about China. One of the main ways that India seeks to manage its relationship with China is by teaming up with other like-minded nations who are concerned about China's rise. And we've already mentioned the Quad. India will chair the 2025 Quad leaders meeting. What should we expect from that? There has been some criticism of the Quad of late that actually as a grouping it might be providing small public goods, but actually it's not doing very much to help the balance of power in the region, and therefore is failing in its task of managing the rise of China. But what's your view?
Yeah, so the Quad, if you just look at the recent events that have taken place, which was this big Delaware summit chaired by President Biden, the statement that came out and all the narrative that emerged was that Quad is here to stay. And for what it's worth, despite there's been a lot of debate where are the weak links and what it has been able to deliver and what it has not been able to deliver. It has been largely able to sustain momentum. In fact, it was under President Trump's first term that Trump administration championed sort of this elevation of the Quad to a cabinet level meeting, and you saw that coming together and a lot of focus on the free and open Indo-Pacific, for which the Quad is kind of like the flag bearer. But coming into 2025, it's an important one, because India is going to be chairing it. It was supposed to this year, but unfortunately couldn't work out because of schedules. And then you'll have a new United States president who may or may not, but may travel to India for the summit. And if he does, and his participation, I think that will give you clues as to how much importance, at least from the United States, the Quad continues to have, or will there be some recalibrations towards the Quad? The expectations from the Quad have largely from the formation of it. It started with being this big organization that comes in, this grouping that helped with HADR prominently, but focusing a lot on cooperation and humanitarian assistance and climate change management and issues like health security. But there's been some limited sort of maritime security cooperation, but you see a lot between these four Quad countries happening, not so much under the Quad branding, though. So, what for Quad to really kind of remain relevant because it's a period where, for India, for example, it's part of so many minilaterals. There's Quad is one of them. So how would Quad in the sea of emerging and existing minilaterals continue to maintain relevance would be not only just for the four countries, but for every other country that wants to work with the Quad, or the Quad wants to work with them, as to how they can manage deliverables under this Quad branding. Will there be a push from the United States for the Quad to become more of a security alliance? And if it does, then would countries like India within the grouping comply? Now, these are questions that will be important to sort of explore and see in the coming year.
Great. One other issue, but big international issue coming up next year, relates to the ongoing war in Ukraine. So I will dip into my pot of questions here. Please do ask any more if you want to ask. But Nico Lusinger, who is the executive director of the Asia Society Switzerland office, asks, European leaders are often worried about India's ties to Russia. How is India thinking about this relationship, and how do we think it will develop? So actually, I wonder if I could turn to you. This is primarily an economic question, or at least partly for India, as in it has strong economic ties in terms of energy, defense, and other elements to Russia. There's also a Ukraine peace process next year in which India may play perhaps not a central but a supporting role. And what is that outlook for? In a sense, what is India's outlook on its relationship with Russia in the coming year, with a Putin visit looming, and how do you see that progressing?
I think if you'd asked anyone in 2021 or 2020 that Russia's contribution to India's total energy or oil imports is going to be close to 30 or 40%, I think you may have been laughed out of the room. But that's the opportunity India got with the price cap that the West has put on Russian oil. And for those of you who are not familiar, the price cap was set at $60, and so this was not a sanction. I think our petroleum minister has also made it clear several times. People often get mistaken. It's a price cap of $60, and India had this wonderful opportunity to buy oil for $60. And which really comes our way. And not only that, but when we were also then processing and reselling the refined petroleum products back, a lot of it back to Europe, actually, for its use. So I think in terms of energy, that it has come down from the peak of 30 or 40% now. Also, the Americans had their energy imports, or actually exports to us, had gone up. There was a point when we were getting crude oil from the United States, and it was like the fourth or the fifth largest crude oil source for us. So I think the energy relationship is likely to be maintained. I think that defense relationship, I'm not a defense expert, but from all indicators are that's likely to maintain. What's probably going to be a real wrench in the wheel is going back to the previous question, are we going to be able to maintain a financial payment network or some kind of a system by which we are able to make the relevant payments to Russia? And that I'm unsure of, given Mr. Trump's recent statements. And we have tried different kinds of solutions in the past, also holding payments to Russia and not sending it keeping it within India. We're now trying local currency settlement system, but that's the big risk I see, is actually how will we make the payments? So other than defense and energy, a lot of the other technology transfer actually is not happening with Russia. The United States, Germany, and Japan, these are the top three countries, and to some extent South Korea, are the countries with which India now has the deepest technology transfer and economic relations. So I think the relationship with Russia is likely to stay on course. While I think I'm hoping that with Japan and Korea, as well as with Germany, I think it might deepen.
Okay, thanks, Akshay. And as I say, we await President Putin's arrival in Delhi. I think now early in the new year is the latest that I saw when this
That's
is
the latest news. Yes, that he's coming for the annual summit. Yeah.
due to happen. Ambassador, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on Ukraine or Russia, but I wanted to ask about Gaza. We had a question from Azad Asa, who asks about India's independent foreign policy, but also one that is very close to the US as well as to Israel, against the backdrop of accusations of genocide in Gaza. Maybe Azad asks, could you say something about these ties with Israel and India's attitude to the Gaza conflict and the Middle East in general? So perhaps I could ask you to comment on that.
Okay. Before that, I'd just like to say a few words about Quad and about the Quad. And, the term maritime democracy, I think, defines very much the membership of all the countries in the Quad today. And from that, I think you can construe and infer the relevance of our relationships, despite the fact that, we may have 26 committees on technology cooperation between the Quad countries. There is a very important maritime domain awareness component to these relationships, this quadrilateral relationship, and I think that seems to trouble the Chinese much more than anything else, which is, I think, an indicator of the effectiveness of the Quad. And under the Biden administration, certainly the levels of interaction have been increased, and now it's at the summit level, So the Quad is not in a bad place at all. When it comes to Russia and the Ukraine, of course, one of the priorities, I think, outlined by Mr. Trump is to put an end to the war. And he says too many people are dying, as this recent article in The Economist quoted him as saying. So obviously, and he's appointed a special envoy for Russia and Ukraine, and there've been some writing in the public domain about a possible peace plan. So we'll have to see at what terms this peace will be imposed, if I may use that word, on Ukraine, and whether Russia will accept the terms and what kind of security guarantees can be provided for Ukraine. As far as India is concerned, this relationship with Russia is important. In some ways, it's a legacy relationship, but it continues to have relevance in terms of our national security interests. And let us remind ourselves that India is very much both a continental and a maritime country, and our continental priorities and concerns and interests tie us very much with Central Asia and Russia. And I think that is a constant. Many of our friends in the West tend to compartmentalize these issues. And I think India tends to see this in a much more holistic way. And that is really the way we are. Geography, is omnidirectional in so many senses of the word. And I think the world needs to recognize what multi-alignment means, therefore, in this context, and why diversity defines that foreign policy working for India. And now, you spoke about Gaza and the terrible things that have been happening there. And I think as Indians, we're all concerned. And I don't talk as a policy person now because I'm very far removed from government and have been in retirement for some years now. But as a human being, as a person, as an Indian, as a country that has always prided itself on its plurality and diversity. Obviously, what has been happening, the level of scale of human suffering in Gaza is just beyond comprehension. And I believe that we should all be concerned because the bell literally tolls for all of us in this context. The relationship between India and Israel, India and the United States, no doubt is very strong and has endured and grown in the last few years. But I think, it would be incorrect to say that India has abandoned the interests of the Palestinian people. That has always been one of the cornerstones of our foreign policy. And given our relationship now with the Arab world, with the Gulf states, it is very strong and diversified. And you've seen the reaction in the Gulf states among the people at the popular level, particularly as to what is happening between Israel and Gaza, Israel and Lebanon, for instance. So while India is, I would say, has not been an influencer about the course of this conflict, and we are not party to the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, but we are definitely concerned about the outcomes, and we continue to support the two-state solution, even if the Israelis have stopped talking about it. But I think we need a just, a fair solution that takes into account the interests of the Palestinian people. There's no doubt about it. Otherwise, peace will never come to that region. And even Israel's, stability for the future, I think, comes into question, because it will always be a nation under threat, and it will always look at its neighborhood as threatening it. So that is really not a good place to be in for any country.
One final question, then I'm going to ask a question to the whole panel to wrap up. So an interesting question from Sanjay Vishwanan. How would the panel view a possible Russia, Iran, China axis, given that Beijing is balancing multiple new geometries, the Global Security Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation? So this is something that has caused a lot of comment in the West over recent weeks, with North Korea participating in the war in Ukraine. How does this look from Delhi? Farwa, maybe I could ask you this question, and then I'll ask a general question to close.
In terms of the Russia-Iran-China axis and kind of Beijing trying to balance this and how that might impact South Asia and might impact India. And then that's an important question. India and Iran are also, in close, like they have an established relationship. They have a diplomatic level of exchange. They had multiple this year alone. With Russia, India has an important strategic partnership, one that it's been solidified by multiple meetings, of course, one being Prime Minister Modi's own first visit to Moscow soon after being re-elected for the fourth term. So there's been a lot going on in terms of looking at India's own sort of relationship with, say, Russia and Iran. Then, of course, China, we talked at length about it, so I won't go back into it. Now, how Beijing is, of course, China being China is also going to do what it feels it's serving its interests best from an economic standpoint, from a security standpoint, and sort of you see that come up in terms of the way the question has been posed, balancing these multiple new geometries. When you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where you have both India, you have China, but you also have the likes of Pakistan. That organization's there, and there's a commitment from all parties to continue to be there despite sort of bilateral frictions, which say something with regards to how there's value towards these countries coming together, in sort of that format to keep engaging. Whether it can achieve much and serve much is another question, but diplomatically that grounds for engagement remain. And then you have to see, and it's like I said very early on in my first thing, there's an inevitability to both India being present in the region, whether it's all over, stemming from South Asia now to West Asia, or to China being present in Asia altogether. And how will these countries work with them, or how these countries will work together? This will require, India, and you hear continuously from the foreign ministry also, and from the Indian Prime Minister also, that this is a multipolar world. And I think that's what it is. And in a multipolar world, how these countries will continue to function and continue to work with one another, and keeping in mind that they're all really trying to secure their own strategic interests. That is something that is sort of going to be the nature of this world, increasingly so.
One final question. I'm going to give it to you, Ambassador Rao. We have 1 minute to go, and I'm going to go back to Nico Luschinger from Zurich, Asia Society, Switzerland. He says, having listened to all of our discussion, my sense going into 2025 is that India is in an enviable position with its foreign policy, a friend to everyone, lots of space for maneuver, lots of attention from other global actors. So maybe, Ambassador Rao, to close, maybe you pick one threat to India's global role in 2025. If you were Mr. Modi, what would you be looking out for? What's one big risk that you think India needs to avoid?
I think India's focus has to be on its economy, on its development, and its hope. Its hope is that the global economic environment will help sustain that and will help accelerate that pace of development. So we're really looking at a global environment, which maybe one is hoping against various challenges, given the situations that confront us today. But by and large, I think India's effort will be to maintain stability in its relations with the outside world, with the sole purpose of ensuring that its GDP continues to grow, because it's that growth in GDP, it's that growth in development, it's that alleviation of the challenges that face sections of our population that really is the focus of any Indian government that is in power in Delhi, and particularly so today. So it is, the core reality, the hard truth is development. And I think we don't want to face challenges to that. We want the global environment to be stable. We want peace. As Mr. Modi says, this is no time for war. Mr. Trump speaks of peace with strength. We'll have to see how that is defined. Mr. Trump is looking at winning every challenge that faces him. It's, the Chinese talk of win-win situations. I think in the Trump lexicon, those words really don't carry much meaning. So he's looking to win every challenge, every fight that he enters. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But India is trying, keeps a steady hand on the steering, and is trying to confront these challenges in a well-considered, deliberate, well thought out manner.
Thank you, Ambassador. Very good. That is the end of our discussion. We've just reached the top of the hour. We wanted to end on time. So thank you very much to my panelists, Akshay Mathur, Farwa Aamer, and Ambassador Nirupama Rao. Please do keep in touch with the Asia Society. You can follow the work of the Asia Society Policy Institute across a variety of social media platforms, X, YouTube, any of the others that you might care to look at. And we'll have many more interesting events covering matters in Asia over the course of the next year. Thank you very much for joining us.